Well, welcome to this course on the Book of Revelation. We're going to be going through each chapter, chapter by chapter, but these beginning few short segments are just some background issues. If you don't like to think about background issues or history, you can skip over them to the section where we begin the actual text. In this first section, I wanted to ask the question, how do we understand this book? In the history of the approaches to this book, there's generally been four different ways that people have understood the text of Revelation. There is the idealist approach, there is a futurist approach, there is a church historical approach, and finally a contemporary historical, or sometimes called preterist approach. We're going to look at each one of these in turn. So, the idealist. This approach sees the text as describing timeless spiritual truths about the nature and purpose of God. So we don't try to look at Revelation to see anything specific about the past or the future. An idealist would probably still acknowledge that there are passages about the final things, but in general, the images are just timeless spiritual truths about God. Some of the earliest allegorical interpretations of Revelation were of this sort, so there is a history and a kind of pedigree for this. And the approach even has some more recent exponents as well. So this is a possible approach to Revelation. Another approach is what we might call the futurist approach. Probably not what's pictured here. It was a rival school of early interpretation, and it saw Revelation as a prediction of the imminent end and advent of a millennial age. Now, among the early church fathers, some of them initially thought that Revelation was talking about a literal 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth, and the church actually condemned this view as being not correct. During the 12th century, this view was revived a little bit in Joachim of Fiore, and there actually has been a strong revival of this approach in the 20th century. There's a story here. It began with a former Catholic priest, John Nelson Darby, who created an approach to the end times called dispensationalism. And this view was then taken up at a famous Protestant seminary, Dallas Theological Seminary. And one of the professors there, Schofield, created a reference Bible which took this approach and put it in the footnotes, extensive notes at the bottom of a King James Bible. And this became one of the most popular Bibles, perhaps during the early 1900s, precisely the era that my grandfather studied at Moody Bible Institute. Now, to be honest, this approach kind of faded. Scholarship continued and Protestants became less interested in it. But a couple of popular authors kind of revived the thinking among popular preachers. One of them was someone who wrote a book called The Late Great Planet Earth, Hal Lindsey, and he was incredibly specific on what he thought the book of Revelation and other parts of the Bible, other prophetic parts of the Bible, were predicting, right down to predicting what Russia was going to do, and that certain images in the Bible were Russian attack helicopters. And his predictions were so specific that eventually they were wrong, and he had to revise and keep publishing different editions of his book. Again, this approach kind of faded, but along came another person, Tim LaHaye, and he wrote a series of novels called Left Behind, a whole series of them. And they were very, very popular among certain groups of people. And because of that, this background thinking about dispensationalism and the rapture and all this sort of thing, again, was revived. And there was even a Left Behind movie, I think a series of Left Behind movies. So during the 20th century, we've seen an ebb and flow of this specific thinking. The Catholic Church does not agree with any of this. Another approach is what we might call church historical, and this saw Revelation as a kind of prediction of the ages through which the church would progress over time. So it is a historical reference, but not only to the end times, of course, it talks about the end of the world, but it also, in a kind of metaphor, references different ages of the church. Baron Gaudius was perhaps a good example of this in the 9th century, the first to suggest that it really was about the history of the church up to his. And finally, there is what we might call the contemporary historical or preterist approach. And this was fueled particularly by the rise of biblical criticism and a rediscovery of the historical context of Revelation's writing. So people began to investigate what would Revelation mean to the people who would be hearing it in the first century or perhaps the second century. And so they would be more focused on the Romans and the conquest eventually of Jerusalem and so forth. Now, one thing to bear in mind is that each one of these approaches is possible. There might be ways in which the approach is being used that would rule it out. But this is an important thought for many Catholics as they approach the Bible. Many times we're used to reading the Catechism, and if the Catechism says that the Trinity has a certain character, that there are three persons but one God, of course, it is not allowed to change any of that. We can't have four persons in the Trinity. Well, it wouldn't be a Trinity anymore. And we can't say that Jesus is merely a man. He has to be fully God and fully man. But sometimes we take that kind of an approach and we move over to the Bible and we assume that the Bible has only one valid interpretation, or maybe we have a particular commentary of the Bible by a particular Catholic author that we enjoy reading, and we assume that if that author said the Bible means something in a particular passage, that it would be perhaps contrary to the faith to contradict that interpretation. Well, actually, that would be a completely false understanding of the Bible. The Catholic Church has condemned a few understandings of the Bible. So, for example, we cannot believe in a literal millennial reign of Christ upon the earth. And there are certain other passages where the Church has clearly defined what we cannot believe, not what we can. But the truth is that you would be able to blend even these various interpretations. You could see an idealist approach to this, but a slightly futurist approach to that, and maybe some interpretation of something that was purely historical from the time of the writer, St. John. So really, many of these approaches are possible at the same time, and there really isn't one approach that is the only approach to Revelation. And so as I go through this book, I'm going to highlight what I think is the most likely meaning of a particular passage, but it's very possible that another approach could be taken and a different understanding could be had, of course, provided that understanding doesn't contradict what we know from Catholic doctrine. So thank you for joining me for this little introduction to how to approach the book